Hello, and welcome to Horns of Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this first Horns episode of 2022, we have a special two-part edition, hearing from author Wesley Morgan about his book, The Hardest Place, The American Military Adrift in Afghanistan's Pech Valley. Morgan essentially wrote a biography of the Pech Valley as a location for U.S. military operations in Afghanistan. As he details in his introduction, his interest began while he was an undergraduate, doing embedded work, working towards his senior thesis. He decided to trace the history of how certain outposts came to be where they were, and in doing so, trace the changing history of American strategy, tactics, and indeed the entire effort in the war in Afghanistan. Morgan's talk is fascinating, it is thorough, it is a sympathetic and unsparing view of a conflict that defined a generation of the military as well as a generation of Americans and Afghans. This event was hosted jointly by the McCombs Business School and the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Austin, and is introduced by Paul Edgar, Associate Director of the Clements Center. Let's listen in.
My name is Paul Edgar. I am the Associate Director of the Clements Center for National Security. Just bear with me as I thank and acknowledge a few folks and make a few introductory remarks before I turn it over to Wes. So first, I want to thank the unrivaled Clements Center events team, Elizabeth Dowdy and Emily Birch, who coordinated guest travel, facilities, and everything else that moved this event from concepts to reality. So thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, Emily. For those of you who know them, I encourage you to thank them, especially during the break as you cross paths. Second, our partners here at the McCombs Business School, in particular, Professors Kishore Gawand and Robert Prentice from the Department of Business, Government, and Society, and Dean of the McCombs School, Dean Lillian Mills. Thank you for your support of the Clements Center, our educational mission, and especially thanks to Professor Kishore Gawand, who so enthusiastically volunteered to co-sponsor this event. I can't tell you how refreshing it is to work with the BGS department and McCombs. I don't want to throw shade on other schools or departments, but let's just say McCombs has a knack for getting things done in ways that maybe some other people do not. So thank you. This event is just a small example, additionally, of our growing partnership with McCombs. It's a partnership that we're very excited about in the Clements Center. The connection between the health of American private business and the health of our national security is both deep and profound, and we hope to expose in an educational way that crucial mutual reliance and educate our students and our public audiences about it more and more so that we don't take it for granted and so that we look after the health of both fields or enterprises. Another example of our partnership with McCombs, we received final approval just 2 weeks ago to offer a minor in business and national security, and that program will start in the fall of 2022. The Clements Center will market the program, manage enrollments, and track student progress, while business, government, and society will audit and confer the degree. So with those thanks and acknowledgments, we'll move on to the first session in today's program. And I'm very honored to present to you Wes Morgan, war journalist and author, who is going to talk about his book, The Hardest Place, The American Military Adrift in Afghanistan's Pech Valley. I've known Wes for a little over 10 years now. Shortly after he graduated Princeton and began working as a research assistant for a prominent New York Times journalist who covered the national security beat, especially our war in Iraq. And as a soldier myself, and as someone commissioned to lead soldiers in my previous career, I always wanted good journalists spending time with and around my unit. Most of us wanted that. We weren't trying to hide anything. We wanted transparency, and we wanted Americans to get a lucid sense of what we were doing so that they could faithfully support our effort in a host of different ways, or alternatively, so that they could learn about what we were doing, decide that they disagree, change their mind, and vote or lobby to move us out. Our system of government relies on good journalism, access to good information, something that we're struggling with to some degree today. And Wes was a good journalist. I was glad to have him around and interested in what I was doing and what my unit was doing. More recently, Wes has done us a great service with this book in particular, The Hardest Place, tracing almost 20 years of the history of our war in Afghanistan in one particular location. By telling this geographically focused history, Wes captures so many things. He captures things that are sane, things that are driven by coherent logic, valor, and incremental success. But that's absolutely side by side with our naivety and gullibility and ignorance and unintentional mistakes and our failures. And our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan contained all of these things at the same time. Reading books like this one that Wes has written should help us to do a better time the next time around. Not because it offers particular solutions, but because it reveals the texture of a particular war in a particular place, which can help us anticipate that other wars in other places will have a texture as well, and that we need to understand it and get to know it and respond to it in ways that maybe we missed this time around, and so that we can set policy more constructively. So Wes, thanks for coming, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
You're a bit taller than I am. Yeah, it's great to be here. This is actually one of the few in-person events I've been able to do because of COVID since this book came out this past March. What I'm going to do is just basically walk through over the next half hour or so, describe the scope of the book, the events that happen in it, why I wrote it, and then look forward to taking questions. I know there's a number of familiar faces in the audience, as well as people I haven't met before, but who I know have served up in this unusual part of Afghanistan. So the book is called The Hardest Place, The American Military Adrift in Afghanistan's Pech Valley. And it focuses on not just the Pech itself, but on its tributaries, on the series of little valleys that flow into it up in the Kunar-Nuristan provinces of northeastern Afghanistan. Paul asked me to describe a little bit what the place looks like, which I think is a good idea because it's extraordinarily difficult terrain. And the terrain itself is really a character in the book, almost the main character in the book. As U.S. forces struggle not just with enemy forces who are finding sanctuary up there in part because of the difficult terrain, but also with the terrain itself as they struggle to overcome just the steepness of the mountains, the weather that provides obstacles to helicopters and drones, and everything in between. Trees as well. It's one of the few really heavily forested parts of Afghanistan, which many people who've imagined Afghanistan or have seen other parts of the country are surprised to learn. We're talking about a place about 150 miles northeast of Kabul, 150 miles northeast of Kabul, not too far from the border with Pakistan, but not right along the border with Pakistan. There's a river that runs parallel to the border called the Kunar River, and then the Pech flows down into that river from the mountains in Nuristan, from very tall mountains that rise up to 15,000 feet above sea level. The Pech flows down from there. And it's joined by these tributaries, some famous places like the Korangal Valley, where the lone survivor episode, Operation Red Wings, notoriously happened in 2005. The Waigal Valley, where the Battle of Wanat happened in 2008. These all join the Pech as it flows down toward where it joins the Kunar River at the Kunar provincial capital of Asadabad, which is really the only city in the province of Kunar. I first visited this place in the summer of 2010, which was the summer of President Obama's surge, when U.S. force levels in Afghanistan were rising very rapidly from, a couple of years earlier, they had been in the 30,000s. By the end of 2010, they would be pushing 100,000. The Pech was one of several places I visited that summer. It was my second Afghanistan trip, fourth war zone trip as a freelance reporter. I had started doing this in 2007 as a college student in between semesters, basically. And the Pech just captured my attention in a way that no other place in these two theaters had, both because of how visually stark it is, the stunning terrain that you see, which I'll describe briefly. Essentially, there's a ribbon of bright, lush green on the narrow valley floor. which is where most of the people live. It's where the road is. It's where most of the towns are, although not all. And then above that, you kind of have different layers of forest as you ascend into the mountains. Visible from this green ribbon of cornfields and everything down below, there's a lower layer of evergreen oak forest, kind of smaller trees that people use in their everyday lives for everything from animal feed to firewood to using the twigs for toothbrushes. And then up above that, which you can't really see from the valley floor, there is thick conifer forest, firs, spruces, pines, cedars, which winds up being really important to the story in a number of ways, not just in terms of the obstacles that it presents to the U.S. military, the physical obstacles that the trees present, but also there's a commercial aspect to logging of cedar that's done up there that plays a role in the story. So it's this unbelievably beautiful and rugged place. And so that was one thing that struck me about the Pech in 2010. Another was the level and type of violence that I saw there. I was used to at that point having embedded with a number of infantry battalions throughout different parts of Iraq and Afghanistan with kind of the war of IEDs, with the war of patrolling either on foot or in Humvees or MRAPs, kind of waiting to get blown up and often not really seeing much of the enemy. In the Pech, there was just an extraordinary amount of ordnance being expended all over the place all the time. And that was just something that was striking and unusual to me. The howitzers out of Fob Asadabad and Fob Blessing up the Pech and Nangalam were active constantly in support of the outposts in the valley. Jets were dropping bombs all the time. And yet there was a strange quality at these outposts, like Combat Outpost Michigan at the mouth of the Korengal, which I describe in the prologue of the book, where it felt like both sides, the U.S. troops down the valley floor and the Taliban up in the hills, kind of had it down to a science, where they were not. Neither side seemed to be suffering the kinds of casualties that they had been suffering in the same place a couple of years earlier. U.S. forces were really dug into these outposts, which I would come to learn had initially looked very different, but by 2010 they were these little concrete fortresses, not too different from what I had seen in Iraq, but very, very separated and isolated from the villages right around them. And then up in the hills, the enemy was firing from well-worn fighting positions, often under huge boulder formations. And you kind of got this sense that, although soldiers were being wounded and sometimes killed on these outposts, everybody had the routine down. U.S. troops, knew exactly where to shoot back at, and the enemy knew exactly how long it was going to be before different, calibers of mortar shells started falling, exactly how long it was going to be before howitzer shells started falling, exactly how long it would be before attack aviation arrived and bombs started falling. And so you got the sense that not very many of them were really being killed either up in these their kind of rock fortresses up there that were often pretty impervious to artillery and JDAMs, satellite-guided bombs. And then the other two things that really fascinated me in 2010 were, one, there was a huge difference between the attitude of the battalion commander in the Valley, a guy named then Lieutenant Colonel Joe Ryan. He's now a two-star general in Hawaii. Has gone back to Afghanistan just over and over again in various roles since then. Had already been in Afghanistan a number of times in 2010. And the other units that I saw throughout the country during that summer of the surge. This was a summer when U.S. forces were spreading out all over eastern and southern Afghanistan. They were building new outposts, starting new road projects. And battalion commanders that I visited would often kind of in the in-brief, rattle off to me all of the indicators, all their kind of inputs that they were putting into the counterinsurgency effort. How many new outposts they built, how many more new outposts they were planning to build by the time they handed things off to their successor. And Colonel Ryan in the Pech pretty much did the opposite. I mean, he took me by surprise in my kind of initial, meeting with him at his headquarters, Fob Blessing, before I went out to his companies and platoons, by basically saying that the time for U.S. forces expanding in this part of the country is over. U.S. forces have kind of reached their culmination point. We're not doing any good here anymore. And this matched with what I wound up seeing. I mean, kind of what you expect from counterinsurgency of the type that the military was trying to practice in Afghanistan was that these outposts are supposed to be securing the population, helping kind of provide space between where the people live and where the insurgents are. And that was not what was happening in the Pech in 2010. What was happening in the Pech in 2010 was, instead of being bubbles of security, these outposts were almost bubbles of conflict and danger. They were drawing in enemy fighters. I would come to learn that this hadn't always been the case. The war in the Pech in 2010 looked very different from how it had looked even a year to 2 years earlier, when the fighting had been much higher in the hills and these outposts really had been functioning as kind of bubbles of security. But you got the impression in the Pech in 2010 that mostly who was bearing the burden of this conflict was the very people who were supposed to be being secured, the people in the villages outside of Cop, Michigan, Cop, Able, Maine, Cop, Honaker, Miracle, as the little outposts were known. And then finally, I was really fascinated by, I would visit these little outposts. And of course, it's not the job of a company commander at an outpost like that or anybody under him to know the history of the outpost. That's not, they're there to perform a task, and they would very ably be able to explain what their task and purpose for being there at that moment was. But if you kind of press to, why is this outpost here in the first place? When was it built? Who built it? Not that it was their job to know this, but they wouldn't know it. And that was striking to me because in many other parts of the country, outposts were much newer. I mean, they had been built during the previous rotation or the rotation before that. In the Pech, it wasn't like that. In the Pech, they'd been around for longer. U.S. troops had been doing coin for longer. And before that, they'd been doing something else, which is what I would come to learn. But basically, you'd go to a place like Cop, Michigan, ask the company commander this question, what's this place doing here? And he'd say, well, it was here, here when the company commander before me got here. Pretty sure it was here when the company commander before that got here. It was as though it might as well kind of have always been there. It was already lost in the mists of time, kind of 9 years into the U.S. effort. So initially what I started to do, 10 years ago for a senior thesis in college, and then I later revisited it for this book as the story continued, was just try to figure out how each of these little outposts had gotten there. And initially it was a struggle even to figure out how many outposts there had been at the peak of things, where they had all been. I mean, the units there in 2010, they couldn't point out on a map where the Ranch House or Bella outposts had been in the Weigall a few years earlier. So I started to just interview people, have that company commander put me in touch with the guy before him, have him put me in touch with the guy before him, have him put me in touch with the platoon leader who had it before him, have him put me in touch with the Green Beret team commander who had it before him. And eventually I kind of rewound it to the spring of 2002, about 6 months after 9/11. And so I'll stop here and, from here on, I'll just kind of describe chronologically what the book covers. After that initial prologue that kind of sets the scene in 2010 and explains why I got interested in the place. What I learned was that back in the very early years of the war, which are covered in part 1 of the book, it's divided into 4 parts, but in this period of 2002 to 2005, there was a very light footprint of U.S. forces up in this part of the country. They came from different parts of the military. There were Marines, Navy SEALs, Green Berets, CIA officers, but there weren't very many of them. And they were essentially doing, initially, a very narrow counterterrorism mission, a manhunting mission, that then gradually morphed over time into a counterinsurgency mission with kind of these ink blots that would turn into the outposts. So it all kind of began in the spring of 2002, essentially with the CIA and JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, which had been charged with the task of, finding high-value al-Qaeda targets like Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, trying to figure out where bin Laden had gone after he had escaped from U.S. forces in December 2001 at the Battle of Tora Bora. And basically, the trail took them up to Kunar. And in retrospect, we know that this was right. They were on the right track, and they actually came quite close to finding him, to being in the same place at the same time, but not close enough. Bin Laden hid in the summer of 2002 into the fall of 2002 in a place called the Shigal Valley, which is one of these little tiny valleys, next door to the Pech. The same kind of rugged terrain, huge pine trees and everything. And actually, in the fall of 2002, there was a big JSOC raid involving SEAL Team 6 and the 1st Ranger Battalion that had never been written about or before in any kind of open format before this book. I mean, it took me a while even to figure out that it had happened, but in which the U.S. military lost its first helicopter in the province up there. An MH-60 Black Hawk had trouble landing in one of these landing zones and crashed. And U.S. forces actually, they were in the right place. They raided the Shigal probably not too long after bin Laden had left there, but they didn't get him. And then basically the trail dried up. And then what you see start to happen is the mission just keeps kind of being shifted from one element to another of the U.S. military. One piece after another inherits it. So JSOC leaves. They make one more big push in the fall of 2003 called Operation Winter Strike. One more time to try to pick up bin Laden's trail, not knowing that by that time he's moved across the border into Pakistan. He's gone. But when that push ends in the fall of 2003, it leaves behind the second outpost. The CIA and JSOC had established a little place in the spring of 2002 at Asadabad, the provincial capital. And then as part of Operation Winter Strike, the Rangers and 10th Mountain Troops who were supporting them built another outpost at a place called Nangalam, which is the main town up the Pech Valley from Asadabad. This place gets inherited by a team of Green Berets. These Green Berets, they're not there for a counterterrorism mission, a manhunting mission. They're there. They're told that they're there to do counterinsurgency. Although that's sort of not the term that's really in vogue at the time, but it's what the Green Beret Battalion commander back at Bagram understands them to be doing and sends them out there to do. They start to set up a little ink blot of security around Camp Blessing in Nangalam, and they are succeeded after about 6 months by another Green Beret team. And in this rotation of two teams, you kind of start to see one of the problems that recurs in the war, where two units that look the same on paper, and everybody has been to the same schools, and the whole thing is organized the same way, and they've all been trained the same way, pursue diametrically different approaches in the same place. Not really because they've been told to pursue different approaches by higher headquarters, but because it is an extremely distributed effort. Units are kind of out on their own with quite a bit of leeway at that point in the war to figure out what it is that they need to be doing. And what you see happen is the second team becomes fixated on a place called the Korengal Valley, one of the side valleys of the Pech. The first team, who were Utah National Guardsmen, had deliberately left the Korengal alone. They felt that something was going on there with the timber industry. Informants were telling them to go up in there, but perhaps they were being tricked, so they didn't do it. The new team out of North Carolina from Fort Bragg, they started going up into the Korengal because they believed that there was an Al Qaeda operative up there named Abu Ikhlas al-Masri, and they thought that was a place they might be able to find him, and they thought it was a place where they could get into fights and find and kill the enemy, which is how they understood their purpose in Afghanistan. At the end of their deployment, their Green Beret headquarters pulls them out, does not replace them with another team. And the mission passes to a platoon of Marines who initially had been there as additional security for the Green Berets to kind of help them man their trucks, man their guard towers and everything. But when the Green Berets are pulled out, the Marines, who, although supporting them, are not part of their task force, are not pulled out. They're left behind. And now this ink blot counterinsurgency mission passes to a platoon of 40, 50 Marines. And it's as the Marines get out and continue doing not the things that the first A team had been doing, but the things that the second A team had been doing, because that's who they had seen operating there, that the Marines start to get deeper and deeper, pulled deeper and deeper into the Korengal. And then in 2005, which is where part one of the book ends, there is a disastrous and tragic operation called Operation Red Wings, in which a Chinook helicopter full of Navy SEALs and Night Stalker aviation personnel from the Army is shot down in the Korengal by essentially a small-time local insurgent who was using the area to go down onto the Pech Road and plant IEDs targeting the Marines. And this really kicks everything into a higher gear, because this Operation Red Wings, in which 19 Americans are killed, at that point, Iraq is falling apart. There's over 140,000 U.S. troops in Iraq. Afghanistan is almost a forgotten backwater in a lot of ways for the U.S. military. And I think at high levels in Washington, it was often assumed that things in Afghanistan were going well because there weren't a lot of casualties happening there. And the Operation Red Wings disaster raises the KIA count for the U.S. military by a quarter in the space of an afternoon, and kind of brings things back into focus in northeastern Afghanistan. So part two of the book then picks up with what results from this, which is a large conventional Army and Marine operation that we have some people in the audience who I think may have participated in, called Operation Mountain Lion. Pushing up into the Korengal Valley and then into the Waigal Valley north of the Pech. Operation Mountain Lion initiates a period in which conventional infantry battalions of 700, 800 soldiers rotate through the Pech and man a much larger network of outposts, which 132 Infantry, this 10th Mountain Division Battalion, establishes. It eventually becomes about a dozen outposts spread throughout the Pech and the tributary valleys to the north and south of it. When you ask the 10th Mountain guys kind of what they were doing, and this is reflected in the news reports at the time, I mean, it was billed as a counterinsurgency mission. It was ink blot counterinsurgency. They're building a lot more ink blots deeper and deeper. And that is what it was. But there was another aspect to it, too, another layer that took me a long time to uncover, which is essentially that the CIA had kind of been whispering in the ear of the 10th Mountain Division saying, look, you guys have come into this part of the country, you come into RC East with a larger force than your predecessors had. Clearly, you have counterinsurgency on the brain. You're going to be building outposts somewhere. If you do it up in Kunar and Nuristan, this whole push with these additional forces and this big net of outposts, as opposed to say the P2K region a little farther south in eastern Afghanistan, that will benefit us, the CIA, in our counterterrorism mission of trying to pick up bin Laden's and Zawahiri's trail. Because at the time, the CIA's understanding was that, which was not correct, was that bin Laden and perhaps Zawahiri were across the border from Kunar, probably in a place in either the Chitral district of Pakistan or the Bajar agency of Pakistan, which are the adjacent areas to Kunar and Nuristan. And as CIA officers described to me for the book, they really had, they lacked access to those places. They didn't have sources. And so they thought that if the 10th Mountain Division and its successors established all these little outposts up in these places, adjacent up there, this could allow better intelligence collection. And that was kind of the unstated mission that 10th Mountain Division was participating in, but which really gets kind of lost with subsequent units because it was never their formal mission. It was essentially it was an unstated thing. And so as these battalions rotate through, you see, the 173rd Airborne Brigade sends in a very storied battalion called 2503 Infantry. It's replaced by 126 Infantry, which John Rodriguez, who will be speaking later, was the executive officer of the company in the Korengal from that unit. Then 212 Infantry. I know we have at least one 212 Infantry veteran in the audience. Then 1327 Infantry from the 101st Airborne Division. Each of these units inherits a slightly different version of the mission from the previous unit, because each unit pushes the ball forward as they see it. And so the situation is different by the end of their 16 months or 15 months or 12 months. An example that I'll give of this, I'll give two examples. One is the Waigal Valley. This is the valley north of the Pech that actually was the one that the CIA had been most interested in 2006 when it was suggesting to the 10th Mountain Division that it go up there, because there was a town up in the Waigal called Arans, where a number of high-value targets, including both Ahmed Shah, the person who had shot down the Turban 3-3, the Chinook helicopter in 2005, as well as Abu Ikhlas al-Masri, and as well as a figure named Haji Ghafoor, who was thought incorrectly to have harbored bin Laden during his time in Kunar, had all been in Iran in the preceding year. And so that's kind of what drove 10th Mountain Division up there. When the 173rd comes in, the battalion commander, a guy named Bill Osland, essentially makes the decision. He's like, well, look, the CIA has not followed through on, it hasn't put people up at these outposts with us. It's not getting anything out of it. As he put it, an infantry platoon and an LLVI team on a mountainside are not a strategic intelligence collection asset. It's not doing what it was sort of billed to do. So he initiates a pullout from the Waigal that winds up being very, very difficult to execute. And this is the first example of a phenomenon that we see over and over again in the story of the Pech and more broadly in Afghanistan, which is that it is a lot harder to unbuild outposts than it is to build them. When they were built in 2004, 5, 6, or earlier, they often were built with very little oversight. I mean, just kind of with perhaps with the approval of a two-star general in Bagram, but really kind of on the say-so of brigade and battalion commanders who controlled huge expanses of terrain and who were responsible for many provinces at a time. By later in the war, when it's time to come out of these outposts, coming out of them winds up being something that has to be signed off on by a four-star general, and it requires tremendous resources to execute, and those resources wind up being the very same ones that are being required to execute offensive operations everywhere else in the country: Chinook helicopters, Predator drones, things like that. And so often it takes a really long time to execute the pullout from an outpost. And Chosen Company of 2503 Infantry experiences this in their long deployment in the Waigal between 2007 and 2008, which culminates in the Battle of Wanat on July 13th of 2008, in which nine paratroopers are killed. And until this past August was the bloodiest ground incident in terms of U.S. KIAs in Afghanistan of the entire war, excluding helicopter shootdowns and helicopter crashes. Simultaneously, another succession of companies from this same succession of battalions are fighting a parallel war in the Korengal. And in the Korengal, what you kind of see is an example of mission creep in terms of how roads are used in counterinsurgency. There's a unit called Battle Company of 2503 Infantry, which is captured in Sebastian Junger's book War, in the documentary Restrepo, that really takes an extremely ambitious approach to the Korengal, trying to pave a road way up the back of the valley to come down a perpendicular valley in the hopes that this will kind of bring commerce and development to the area. Now, 2503 Infantry does this because what they've inherited from the preceding 10th Mountain Unit is a road just like that on the Pech floor, which has delivered results just like that. There are gas stations up and down the road. The travel time has been cut to a third of what it was previously by the creation of this road. And so when 2503 infantry comes in, they see this road building thing that has been done in the Pech, and they want to replicate it in the Korengal. What they don't understand, and what's lost in the transition, is that the road building experiment in the Pech, really the development and reconstruction aspect of it was almost an ancillary benefit. It was started in 2006 for a much narrower reason, which is that the previous battalion commander there, Chris Cavoli, in 2006, he wanted a hardball road so that it would be harder to put IEDs in it, because he was losing soldiers to IEDs on that road. And so he enlisted the help of the provincial reconstruction team to pave that road. And then from that paving project, other benefits grew, which wound up not being replicable in the Korengal. So then, eventually in 2008, another battalion rotates in, 1st Battalion of 26th Infantry. It's a smaller unit. It's a unit that's on its first combat deployment, and in fact has only very recently been stood up, as opposed to the preceding units, which 2503 of the 173rd Airborne was actually manned at like 105% strength. It's this unit coming out of Vicenza, Italy. It just they were different units, although they looked the same on paper. And the battalion commander of 126th Infantry, who kind of winds up as an unlikely hero of the story, that's how I feel that he is, a guy named Brett Jenkinson. He looks at this and he says, this isn't working. And he's kind of the first guy to look at the Korengal and say, this isn't working. And he winds up spending his whole deployment kind of shouting into the void that this isn't working, and without anybody listening. There's the two-star general who, for a chunk of that time, was the division commander at Bagram, showed me his green notebooks from his pre-deployment site survey before he went to Afghanistan to be the two-star for Eastern Afghanistan. And in it, you can kind of see, after his visit to the Korengal, he's written Korengal, Kamdesh, why? But then in the course of his year in Eastern Afghanistan, these outposts all remain. It kind of becomes the case that everyone can think of a reason to stay, everyone can think of risks to pulling out, and so nobody wants to underwrite the risks of pulling out, and so they stay. Part 3 of the book covers the long U.S. withdrawal, basically, as U.S. forces turn things over to the Afghan National Army. The Afghan National Army promptly collapses. U.S. forces are brought back in to try and stand it up again. And U.S. forces also return for, I would say, more dubious reasons. There are kind of two things that happen. I first visited the Pech in where I start this part 3 of the book in 2010. With 1327 Infantry from the 101st Airborne Division. They've inherited a kind of a shrunken down presence in the Pech. U.S. forces have finally come out of the Korengal, and Joe Ryan, the battalion commander, kind of starts following the same logic and saying, well, all the reasons that led us to come out of the Korengal, don't they apply to the Pech too? And just making the argument that, whatever the Pech may have looked like in 2006 and 2007, it doesn't look like that anymore. And the metaphor that he and his brigade commander, Drew Pappas, who's now the 3-star director of the Joint Staff, make is that, okay, so we've got this metaphor for ink blot counterinsurgency. Maybe the Pech was paper that was absorbing ink at some point, but now it's not. It's like plastic. It's not absorbing the ink. It's just not an appropriate place for counterinsurgency. And they successfully, over the course of their deployment, sell this argument, and right at the end of their deployment, they pull out of the Pech. Then a new division headquarters comes in, new brigade headquarters with new battalions comes in, and the ANA sort of looks like it's on the verge of collapse. Because basically what's happened is, in kind of this is one of many places where this is the case. The U.S. government and the Afghan government were not on the same page about the importance of the Pech when this pullout was executed. As far as U.S. forces were concerned, in 101st, this place was no good. It was not worth the cost of being up there. But for the Afghan government, the costs and benefits were very different. The Afghan government, for one thing, wasn't bearing the costs. U.S. forces were bearing the costs. But for the Afghan government, the Pech was a place that contained 3 district centers, and it also contained the one ground gateway to the provincial capital of Nuristan. So it had political significance that U.S. forces arguably didn't appreciate. And so U.S. forces were taken by surprise in early 2011 when President Karzai himself decides at the last moment, tells General Petraeus, then the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, no, we're staying in the Pech. You may be leaving, but our forces are staying, which was not how the pullout was, supposed to go as far as the 101st and as far as their Afghan National Army partners were concerned. So this ANA battalion starts to collapse. A new battalion from the 25th Infantry Division in Hawaii rotates in. New division headquarters that's never been to Afghanistan before, the 1st Cavalry Division headquarters rotates in. You have a very aggressive 1-star general who's the deputy commander for operations of 1st Cav, who basically directs the brigade pretty much against its will to start going and doing big air assault operations up into the mountains surrounding the Pech to show the enemy that the U.S. still can do this. This is very frustrating to a number of soldiers who are in the unit who have actually been up in Kunar before on previous deployments. As far as they're concerned, these big air assaults are kind of tried and untrue tactics that don't get you anywhere. Nevertheless, they continue to happen. In the course of these operations happening, U.S. forces go back to Want and the Waigal Valley in a completely fruitless operation called Operation Fire Rock. Hammerdown is another one in the Waterpore Valley. Fire Rock results in nothing except 3 separate civilian casualty incidents. These are, it's kind of a pronounced cluster of them, but if you read the book, you'll see that pretty much every chapter describes inadvertent civilian casualties caused by U.S. forces, sometimes by airstrikes in the heat of combat. That's often the most dangerous thing. But also, misunderstandings on the ground. Misunderstandings, U.S. forces rotate in, and during the first couple of weeks of the deployment is a very dangerous time for U.S. forces. The first couple of weeks of a U.S. deployment is also a very dangerous time for Afghans, as people in the Pech came to learn. There's an example I'll give. One of the units that went up there was kind of rerouted at the last moment from, it was going to go to Iraq, instead it went to Afghanistan, so it didn't get a lot of very theater-specific guidance about, what threat it was going to be facing. And so a machine gunner early on in the deployment in the first couple of weeks kills some people in a pickup truck who are coming too fast at him because he's afraid of the possibility of a vehicle-borne IED, which, had they been going to Iraq, would have been an extremely real and dangerous possibility that they would have been facing during the surge period in Iraq, but which in Kunar in the Pech Valley was not a thing that had ever happened in the history of U.S. involvement there. So that's one example of how this can happen. But by the time U.S. forces are doing these big air assaults, in a lot of ways, the population has turned cold to them as a result of these incidents. I describe another civilian casualty incident in the book in 2004, where the first Green Beret team leader to live there inadvertently kills a man. Essentially, a big dog comes at him, a wild dog. The Green Beret team leader shoots the dog. Bullet goes through the dog, ricochets off a rock, and kills a shopkeeper. The Green Beret team leader is terrified that this is going to be the end of their mission, that the people will basically kick them out and riot. But his relationship, the team's relationship with the local community is such that it's kind of the social power structure in the town of Nangalam smooths it over, explains to them how they can make this go away, how they can make reparations to the family. Not that this will make the family forget what has happened, but such that there will not be a violent response, such that the structure of the town and the family will prevent anybody from taking up arms in response to this. Now, over time, you see this happen over and over and over again. And by the 30th time, or say the 5th time for a particular village, people are a lot less willing to kind of let bygones be bygones. Even if it's new units every time. Even if it's new units making honest mistakes. If you're, that person in Kandagal, and this has been happening every summer as new units come in, you're just not going to give the benefit of the doubt in the same way after a while that you did earlier on. So what you see in 2011, 2012 is U.S. forces go back into the Pech on a much smaller scale. They resume kind of an advisory operation there that actually looks a lot more like what the Green Berets were doing in 2004, even though now it's conventional infantrymen doing it, than anything in between. And it's kind of by the luck of the draw that a couple of the key leaders in these infantry companies that go back in 2011 and 2012 are guys who've been in the Pech before. It's not quite the luck of the draw. Actually, in both cases, these are guys, a guy named Lauren Crow in 235 Infantry out of Hawaii, and then a guy named Hugh Miller in 212 Infantry out of Fort Carson, Colorado, are guys who'd been in the Pech before as platoon leaders. Basically, in Lauren's case, came to hate it, really came to feel that U.S. forces were operating in the wrong way in a lot of ways, and engineered a way to go back in the hopes that he could pass some of these lessons on and be the institutional knowledge that in a lot of ways the Army wasn't providing to these units. The other guy, Captain Miller, I think it was more like he just became fascinated with the area, with the people, with the type of fighting up there, and he's one of a number of people that I interviewed who basically engineered ways to go back because they loved it, because they loved the Pech in one way or another. But they help kind of steer things in a better direction where instead of U.S. forces doing their own thing and dragging Afghan forces along to check a box on a list of requirements that you need to go outside the wire, Lauren Crow and Hugh Miller and the others working for them, they arrange a situation where U.S. forces really are advising and supporting the Afghan forces in the valley to do what the Afghan forces want to do. And it turns out what the Afghan forces want to do is double down in the place. And they actually flood the Pech Valley with troops in 2012, 13, 14, and create a situation, which is what I describe in part 4 of the book, where U.S. forces are gone, on the ground anyway, but there is this uneasy balance between the government on the valley floors and the Taliban in the hills. And kind of as far as the government is concerned, this is okay. And the government is willing actually to take pretty heavy casualties once in a while if, for instance, one district center in the Waigal Valley once every year or two basically gets stormed by insurgents and a lot of people killed or taken prisoner. But from the Afghan government's perspective, so long as another Afghan military force is able to quickly come back in and reestablish control of that district center so that it's 51 weeks out of the year it's controlled by the government, that's good enough. And then that's worth the cost of being out there. This gets disrupted eventually by the arrival of ISIS on the scene, which drives the Afghan government and the Taliban into each other's arms in this part of the country, even as they're fighting the bloodiest war on the planet in every other part of the country. So while this is occurring on the ground, up in the air, U.S. forces are continuing their involvement. The Joint Special Operations Command, the kind of counterterrorism organization of Rangers and SEALs that had kicked everything off in Kunar back in 2002 and 2003, returns to kind of having primacy, U.S. primacy in this area, as they execute what they call Operation Haymaker, which is an effort to look for al-Qaeda fighters, in particular a guy named Farouk al-Qahtani, who is not well known outside of the U.S. intelligence community, but who had a very high profile in the U.S. intelligence community in basically the period from 2011 until his death in 2016, to the point where he was seen for parts of this period as one of really the two most urgent al-Qaeda threats in the view of the intelligence community in the Obama administration, along with an al-Qaeda figure in Yemen named Ibrahim al-Asiri, who was responsible for attempts to bring down airliners. And so what the Ranger Regiment and the SEALs are tasked with doing is executing a drone campaign up there, supported by very occasional ground raids. But by this point, the Special Operations community really feels that it's been basically burned. And as one SEAL admiral puts it, he's parked too many helicopters up there to keep doing ground raids. So they do this drone war that eventually succeeds in killing Farouk al-Qahtani. I mean, Operation Haymaker in this sense is a success, but which, and this is a theme that you see come up in earlier parts of the book as well, was really at odds in some ways with the counterinsurgency and nation-building effort and with what the Afghan government was doing. Because, even as the drone campaign drives these al-Qaeda figures deeper and deeper into the hills, what you see happen is basically it kills its way out of targets. After some initial success, killing a number of Arab al-Qaeda figures in 2012, some in 2013, it kind of dries up. And they, instead of working their way higher up toward Farouk al-Qahtani, although they eventually do that, they work their way farther down the chain of command, going after lower and lower level Taliban figures with drone strikes. And something that was really fascinating to me was interviewing especially Waigalis about their experience with this drone campaign, which they saw as in some ways much more precise than previous U.S. efforts. I mean, it kind of bucks a little bit our common understanding that U.S. forces on the ground are better at protecting civilians than U.S. forces in an air campaign are. What Waigalis describe is really a lot of misunderstandings that resulted in deaths of people in their communities during the period when U.S. forces were living up in their outposts up there. And also a very serious civilian casualty incident. I mean, one of the worst of the early years of the war back in 2003 in an incident the CIA was responsible for. But during the Operation Haymaker period, Waigalis, and I'm not speaking here for other communities. I mean, the Wadapur Valley, a place called Gambir, had a really awful civilian casualty incident due to Operation Haymaker that really became a strategic problem between the U.S. government and President Karzai. But in the Waigal, people's complaints were not that women or children were being killed in the drone strikes, which in the Waigal, they say they weren't, but that basically low-level people, low-level fighters who were clearly not part of al-Qaeda, but arguably not really, of importance to the Taliban either, although they were, legal and appropriate targets in that sense. I mean, fighters were being killed. And so everybody has, cousins and brothers and nephews who are being killed for, it's not obvious to them for what reason, even though it's, they acknowledge these are people who are under arms, fighting for the Taliban. And the other complaint is that basically as the drone campaign works its way down the hierarchy, local Taliban officials that they had understandings with and could live with would be killed and replaced by successors who were more paranoid and harsher and crueler, and would launch spy hunting campaigns, torture people, imprison people, make it just much more difficult to live and exist in these communities. And in this way, kind of really turn people against the Afghan government and embitter them against the United States, even though the United States has already left on the ground. And that was one of the big takeaways for me in talking to Waigalis was, and Kunaris as well, was just the description of how disappointed people were by the end, I think, basically there had been all these promises of reconstruction and projects and road building, and that in the end, kind of what they had wound up with was not a lot of that, but they had wound up with outside militant groups that hadn't been there before. Really, Al Qaeda had not really been it had not been in Kunar or Nuristan at all before 2001. Osama bin Laden had ventured up there briefly in his flight from Tora Bora, but really it was the long drawn-out battle between the United States and the Taliban, which itself had had only a light footprint in Kunar and was an outside force in Kunar before 2001, that drew in more Al Qaeda fighters, including Farouk al-Qahtani, as this place became almost like an arena, a place where, the starkness of the terrain, the difficulty of the fighting made it a place where up-and-coming Al Qaeda fighters would be sent basically to earn earn an Al Qaeda combat infantry badge. And some of them would then go on to fight in other parts of the country. Others would stay, as Farouk al-Qahtani did. And so one of the ironies of all this is that it was as a result of this long U.S. presence, which was initiated by a counterterrorism mission looking for an Al Qaeda figure, that more Al Qaeda figures later came in, including Farouk al-Qahtani. I'll end with Farouk is finally killed in 2016 in a successful drone strike, albeit one with a civilian cost that was never disclosed at the time by the military or the Obama administration. It was baked into the plan for the killing of Farouk, as I describe in the book, in a very unusual arrangement. I mean, for the most part, U.S. forces in Afghanistan at that time were held to a standard where if any civilian casualties were expected in a strike, they could not take that strike until they worked out a situation where no civilian casualties were expected. But Farouk, the reason he had survived so long was he understood exactly how all this worked, and he was living up in a compound that he essentially never left, where his wife and children were also known to be. And up at the Secretary of Defense level, which is where the JSOC eventually pushed this up to. It was signed off on that the strike could be taken, even though it was understood that the wife and two children would likely be killed, which they were. No sooner does JSOC finish off Farouk al-Qahtani, then it seamlessly moves on to targeting a new group up there, which is ISIS-K. The group that many Americans became familiar with for the first time this past August. There's a kind of a contradiction in the arrangement that happens up there in the final years of U.S. involvement, where the Afghan government is, it's kind of sided with the Taliban in a way against ISIS in these valleys. And they're collaborating, they're having local truces. And the U.S. military, the JSOC task force, actually supports the Taliban as well in a strange way in this one narrow part of the country, even as it's hammering the Taliban everywhere else in 2018, 2019, 2020. In the later months of 2019, early months of 2020, Team East of the JSOC task force run by the Rangers at Bagram, actually they jokingly call themselves the Taliban Air Force because much of what they wind up doing is they're doing the counter-ISIS mission, drone strikes against ISIS up in Kunar, and they wind up using their signals intelligence collection tools, the listening in on the enemy's cell phone communications and radio communications, now not to figure out where the Taliban is and strike them, but to figure out, okay, we've got a tactical Taliban commander, he's going up X hill at Y time tomorrow morning, and he's concerned about Z ISIS machine gun nest. So that's the machine gun nest we'll strike. And that's kind of the strange close air support of a type that the JSOC task force winds up providing to the Taliban against ISIS in the final phase of U.S. involvement up in that part of the country.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.